There comes a moment when the noise of wanting people softens, and what remains is the truth you were avoiding. The truth that no hand, no voice, no approval was ever meant to complete you. That role was always yours, though you kept placing it in the care of others, hoping they would stitch together the parts you refused to face alone. But wholeness was never built in the presence of constant validation. It was shaped in silence, in the hours when no one was clapping, no one was arriving to rescue you, no one was offering meaning from the outside. In that silence, something difficult begins to happen. You start meeting yourself without witnesses. You start realizing that dependence often disguises itself as love, and expectation often wears the mask of connection. And so you begin again, not loudly, not for attention, but inward. You stop reaching as if emptiness is something another person must fill. You learn instead to sit with your own becoming, to let your identity form without interruption. There is power in no longer begging to be chosen, because you finally understand you were never meant to be assembled by someone else's presence. There is a quiet deception that settles into the mind long before it is ever recognized as deception. It begins as a feeling, subtle and almost harmless, the belief that life is only fully lived when someone else is there to witness it, to confirm it, to reflect it back with approval. It tells a person that their thoughts are incomplete until spoken to another, that their emotions are unreliable until validated, that their identity is somehow unfinished unless it is being held, shaped, or approved by another presence. Over time, this belief stops sounding like an idea and starts feeling like truth. But what it really does is fracture the self into pieces that are constantly handed outward for approval. A person begins to measure their worth in reactions, in replies, in the warmth or distance of others. Silence becomes uncomfortable, not because it is empty, but because it removes the mirrors they have grown dependent on. In that silence, there is no one to confirm the story they have been told about themselves, and so they begin to feel unmade, as if existence itself requires audience participation. This illusion is powerful because it disguises dependency as connection. It makes emotional reliance feel like intimacy, and approval feel like love. A person can sit in a room full of people and still feel hollow, not because they are unloved, but because they have outsourced the act of completion. They wait to be understood before they understand themselves. They wait to be chosen before they choose their own direction. They wait to be reflected before they decide what is real. And in doing so, they slowly abandon the authority of their own inner world. Thoughts become negotiable. Feelings become adjustable. Even dreams begin to shift depending on who is watching. The self becomes flexible in all the wrong ways, bending toward acceptance instead of standing in truth. It is not that other people become dangerous, but that they become necessary in a way they were never meant to be. The deeper wound in this illusion is not loneliness, but fear of solitude, because solitude does not flatter or distract. It does not confirm identity. It exposes it. And when a person has never learned to sit with themselves without external reflection, that exposure feels like loss rather than discovery. So they reach outward again, not because others are required for life, but because stillness feels too honest. Yet Beneath that discomfort lies something unclaimed, a version of self that does not require permission to exist, a presence that does not dissolve when no one is watching, a mind that does not fracture in the absence of applause. The illusion begins to weaken when a person realizes that their emptiness was never proof of incompleteness, but evidence of a habit of looking outward for what was always forming inwardly, quietly, persistently, even in moments when no one was there to name it, define it, or validate it. Solitude is often mistaken for absence, as if being alone means something essential has been taken away. But there is a different kind of solitude that does not subtract, it reveals. It is not the loneliness of being left behind, but the deliberate turning inward, where nothing external is allowed to interrupt the slow, careful work of becoming. In that space, a person is no longer performing identity for others, no longer adjusting their emotions to fit the room, no longer translating themselves into something more acceptable. What remains is unedited, unfiltered, and at first uncomfortable. The discomfort is natural because silence removes distraction. Without voices to answer, without attention to chase, without comparison to lean on, a person is left with their own presence in its rawest form, and that presence can feel unfamiliar, even intimidating, for someone who has spent years measuring themselves through reflection in others. But solitude is not asking for comfort. It is asking for honesty. In that honesty, something begins to shift. The mind, once scattered across expectations and external demands, starts to gather itself. Thoughts that were previously shaped to please others begin to regain their original forms. Feelings that were softened or hidden to avoid rejection begin to surface without apology. There is a quiet recalibration happening, where the self is no longer reacting, but observing. And in that observation, clarity begins to form. Solitude becomes a kind of training ground, not for isolation, but for independence. A person learns to sit with their emotions without immediately seeking relief from another voice. They learn that discomfort does not always require escape, and that not every silence needs to be filled. In this way, solitude strengthens the internal structure of a person's identity. It teaches them that they are capable of holding their own thoughts without collapsing under them. There is also a deep restoration that happens in solitude, though it is not always immediate or pleasant. The constant negotiation of self in social spaces can be exhausting even when it is invisible to others. In solitude, that negotiation pauses. There is no need to perform strength or happiness or agreement. The self is allowed to exist without justification. And in that allowance, energy returns slowly, like something that was scattered finally being called back home. Over time, solitude begins to feel less like emptiness and more like clarity. The noise that once felt necessary starts to feel intrusive. The urgency to be understood by others weakens as understanding oneself becomes more urgent. A person begins to notice that their value does not increase in the presence of others, nor does it decrease in their absence. It simply exists steady and unperformed. And within that realization, the foundation of self-building is quietly laid, not in reaction to the world, but in the steady unfolding of presence that requires no audience to continue becoming. Emotional dependence rarely announces itself as something harmful. It often arrives wearing the language of care, attachment, and closeness. At first, it feels like connection, like finding a place where your feelings can finally land safely in someone else's hands. But slowly, without obvious warning, that care begins to shift into necessity. The presence of another person stops being a choice and starts becoming a requirement for emotional stability. Their mood begins to shape your peace. Their attention becomes the measure of your worth. Their silence feels heavier than your own thoughts. Breaking this pattern is not an act of rejecting people, nor is it an attempt to harden the heart. It is the process of disentangling identity from reaction. Because emotional dependence often forms when a person begins to believe that their internal state must be regulated externally. If someone is close, they feel whole. If someone withdraws, they feel diminished. If someone approves, they feel real. If someone disapproves, they begin to question their own existence. Over time, this creates a fragile self that is constantly adjusting, constantly scanning, constantly waiting. What makes emotional dependence difficult to recognize is that it can feel like love. It can feel like deep attachment, like intensity, like meaning. But true connection does not erase the self in order to maintain itself. Emotional dependence, however, often does exactly that. A person begins to abandon their own emotional language in favor of interpreting the emotions of others. They become more aware of external shifts than internal truth. Their inner world becomes secondary, almost negotiable, depending on who is present. To break free from this does not mean withdrawing from people entirely. It means returning authority to the self. It means learning to sit with discomfort without immediately searching for someone to resolve it. It means noticing when anxiety is not a signal of danger, but a signal of absence of external reassurance. In those moments, the real work begins, because instead of reaching outward, the person is asked to remain present with what they feel without outsourcing its resolution. There is a quiet grief in this process, because dependence often forms around places where care once felt essential. Letting go of that pattern can feel like losing something important, even when what is being lost is instability, disguised as safety. But beneath that grief is something more enduring, the gradual return of emotional self-trust. A person starts to recognize that feelings are not instructions to seek rescue, but experiences that can be held, understood, and moved through internally. As emotional independence grows, relationships begin to change shape. They are no longer the only source of emotional regulation, but spaces of shared experience rather than emotional survival. The intensity that once felt necessary begins to soften into steadiness. The need to be constantly reassured diminishes, replaced by a quiet confidence that does not require constant confirmation. And in that shift, the self stops living in reaction and starts existing in presence, no longer shaped by the emotional availability of others, but grounded in an inner steadiness that does not collapse when external attention fades. Growth that happens in silence is often the kind no one knows how to measure because it does not announce itself. It does not arrive with applause or recognition, and it rarely aligns with the versions of success people are taught to display. Instead, It unfolds in private moments, in decisions no one witnesses, in habits no one praises, and in struggles that do not become stories told to others. It is the kind of growth that does not ask to be seen, because its only task is to transform the person living it. In a world that rewards visibility, silence can feel like absence. People begin to believe that if something is not witnessed, it is not real, as if value depends on being observed. But growth does not follow that rule. It often prefers the hidden spaces, where there is no pressure to perform progress, no expectation to appear healed, and no need to justify the slow pace of change. In those spaces, a person is free to fail without explanation, to begin again without embarrassment, and to rebuild without external timelines. This kind of growth is uncomfortable at first because it removes external validation. Without someone noticing improvement, the mind can question whether anything is actually changing. Without recognition, effort can feel invisible, and invisibility can be mistaken for stagnation. But beneath that doubt, something deeper is forming. Discipline begins to replace motivation. Awareness begins to replace reaction. Patterns that once controlled behavior start to lose their grip, not because someone is watching, but because the person is finally watching themselves. Growth in silence also demands honesty in a way public change does not. When no one is watching, there is no performance to maintain. A person cannot pretend consistency when only they are aware of their actions. This forces a confrontation with truth, not the version of self that is presented to others, but the version that exists when everything external is removed. In that confrontation, excuses lose their power, and clarity begins to take root. There is also a deep rebuilding of identity that happens quietly. A person begins to separate who they are from who they were told to be. They start to question inherited beliefs, repeated habits, and emotional reactions that once felt automatic. This process is slow, sometimes repetitive, often invisible, but it is where real change is formed, not in sudden transformation, but in repeated inner decisions that gradually reshape the direction of a life. Over time, silence becomes less like emptiness and more like a workspace. It becomes the place where strength is not declared but developed, where confidence is not displayed but built through repetition, where resilience is not performed but practiced in private moments of continuation after failure. There is no audience to impress, only a self to rebuild, and that makes the process both heavier and more honest. And within that quiet space, a person begins to realize that the most lasting form of change is not the one that is seen by others, but the one that no longer depends on being seen at all. Existing steadily even when recognition never arrives. There comes a turning point in a person's inner life when the desire to be chosen begins to lose its urgency. It does not disappear suddenly, nor does it end with certainty, but it begins to loosen its grip. For a long time, being chosen feels like proof of worth. It feels like confirmation that something within you is acceptable, desirable, enough. So people spend years shaping themselves around that hope, adjusting their tone, their silence, their presence, even their absence, in order to increase the chances of being selected by someone else's attention. But this constant waiting creates a quiet exhaustion. It teaches the mind to live in anticipation rather than presence, to measure value through external decision rather than internal certainty. When someone else's acceptance becomes the final authority on identity, the self is never fully lived, only evaluated. And in that evaluation, a person can begin to forget that they existed before they were noticed and would still exist even if they were not. Becoming complete before being chosen is not about rejecting love or refusing connections. It is about refusing the belief that connection is what completes what was already whole in formation. It is the recognition that wholeness is not a reward granted by others, but a state built internally, piece by piece, often in moments of solitude, reflection, and quiet endurance. When a person begins to understand this, the need to be chosen shifts from necessity to possibility. It becomes something welcomed, not something required. There is a deep change that happens when validation is no longer treated as the foundation of identity. The emotional center of gravity moves inward. Decisions are no longer made from the fear of being left out or overlooked, but from a clearer sense of self-direction. The mind stops asking, "Will they accept me?" and begins asking, "Does this align with who I am becoming?" That shift alone changes the way a person walks through the world. This does not mean the desire for connection disappears. It means it no longer defines survival. Relationships begin to feel less like lifelines and more like shared spaces between two already formed selves. There is less desperation in attachment and more clarity in presence. A person is no longer trying to be completed by someone else's arrival, but simply choosing to share their already existing life with another. Being complete in this way also changes how rejection is experienced. It no longer feels like disappearance or erasure. It becomes a redirection rather than a collapse. When identity is not dependent on external selection, absence does not destroy the self. It simply reveals that not every space was meant to hold it. This understanding brings a quiet stability where emotional balance is no longer entirely dependent on being affirmed by others. Over time, a person begins to stand in their own life with a different kind of presence. They are not waiting to be defined, chosen, or completed. They are already engaged in the process of becoming, regardless of who notices. And in that steady becoming, they move through the world not as something unfinished, seeking approval, but as something already whole, still evolving, still open, but no longer dependent on arrival of anyone else to begin existing fully.